Good day, everyone. Welcome to another one of our midweek Bible studies. Thank you for joining us today. As you can see on this title screen, we are going to be covering what are called the pastoral letters in this. We're continuing in our study, finishing up actually, the letters of Paul, and we're going to look at these letters. So what are the pastoral letters that we've got on here, okay? The pastoral letters are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. They're put together because they have kind of similar content and tone. They're about the same length, written to individuals. Okay, so it's different than the other letters of Paul. Most of the other letters are addressed to churches in specific cities. So you have the letter to the Philippians, the letter to the Romans, letter to the Colossians. Of course, the one exception is the book that I preached on last week, the letter to Philemon. But these letters are even different from that letter. These letters, even though they're addressed to specific people, unlike Philemon, Philemon's letter was really like a personal correspondence. Okay, it was written to a person or a small group of people and the church that were meeting in that household. But it was very much a personal correspondence between Paul and mainly to Philemon. Whereas these letters here, the Pastoral Epistles, they are addressed to people, Timothy and Titus, but they kind of deal with more generalized ideas. Okay, they're not personal letters at all. They are kind of general advice for dealing with issues in the church and pastoral leadership. Okay, and so they're pretty much unique among the letters of Paul. These letters really do stand out as being quite different from anything else that Paul has written. So now let's get into these. The historical background of these, there's some pretty interesting details here. You have these letters, and of course, 1st and 2nd Timothy, addressed to Timothy, and then the book of Titus. Both of these men were companions of Paul. They made several trips with him. Both of them are mentioned in a number of Paul's letters. And they played pretty important roles in Paul's ministry. Timothy is mentioned in Acts, as I have here, and in a number of Paul's letters as well. He's even mentioned as a co-author of several of these letters. So obviously, a very close companion of Paul, even wrote down some ideas that are conveyed to us now in some of these letters. Paul very much, was very close to. You can sense that Paul very much loved and trusted Timothy. He even mentions in a number of these letters that he sent Timothy on a number of missions. Missions in Paul's name. He talking to the Corinthians, this sort of troublesome church. He says in several places things like, greet Timothy, I'm going to send him to you. Greet him as you would greet me. And so, this troublesome church with a lot of issues and a lot of complicated problems. When Paul can't go there himself, he sends Timothy and really says, think of him as having pretty much my authority. Paul describes Timothy in the letter to the Philippians as being to him like a son. He says in kind of the same spot in Philippians that he has nobody like Timothy. Okay? And so this was a very special person to Paul, very much trusted Timothy with some of these very difficult and sensitive missions that Timothy ran even in Paul's name and under his authority. I believe that church tradition suggests that Timothy was actually the first bishop of the church at Ephesus. And very prominent person in the early church and certainly in Paul's ministry. Now moving on to Titus. Who was Titus? He was a Gentile Christian, and his hometown is unknown, although it is suggested that he was likely from the city of Antioch, which was a prominent city for the early church, early Christian activity, and Titus likely came from there. He's mentioned in several places as being connected to Antioch. Titus is mentioned in a really interesting section of the Bible here in Galatians chapter 2, when Paul talks about this trip that he made to Jerusalem in order to discuss with some of these leaders about what to do with Gentiles who wanted to become Christians. Okay, did they need to become circumcised? And of course we know that Paul went there to argue very passionately that the Gentiles should not be required to be circumcised. And in Galatians 2, Paul reports some pretty heated discussions, some pretty contentious discussions that he had with these leaders. He shows that he has respect for them as leaders and the original apostles, but he also says that they didn't really add anything to him. They couldn't really tell him anything because he was an apostle just like them. A very difficult time in Paul's ministry when he was called on to really defend his position and his ideas. And Titus accompanied Paul to this meeting for support, I'm sure, as a friend and a colleague, but also, interestingly enough, as this almost test case, okay, or example. Paul brought him along, to give them, a face. We're not talking about just this idea or this category of Gentile Christians. No, let's bring an actual Gentile. So you have to look him in the eye and give him your answer, or make your decision. This is an issue that is not just some kind of theological issue, that we're going to debate. This is actually something that affects people's lives, and it will affect the gospel going forward. And so, Paul brought Titus along with him to this crucial meeting in Jerusalem, and that should show just how much regard Paul had for Titus, and how much he figured that Titus's testimony and Titus's appearance there would mean for his own argument and his own position. Titus is described as a close companion of Paul. 2 Corinthians talks about him as a partner and co-worker. In fact, Titus plays a really important role in the letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians there. Paul actually says that he sent Titus to the Corinthians, after this really difficult and painful letter. It seemed like the Corinthians were going to be going away from Paul and rejecting him, and so Paul wasn't able to go in person, but he sent Titus to to kind of plead Paul's case and see what could be done to effect a reconciliation between Paul and the church. And sure enough, Titus proved himself to be very skilled, a peacemaker, a troubleshooter, and we find out in 2 Corinthians that actually Titus's mission was successful, and the Corinthian church ended up repenting and coming back to Paul, and Paul said that he was just overjoyed by this. Okay, in 2 Corinthians 7, we have the results of Titus's efforts there with the Corinthians, and it showed that just how intelligent, how resourceful, and what kind of a pastor's heart he had, because he was able to diffuse this very difficult situation and bring peace and reconciliation and repentance where there was a lot of tension and even bad feelings. So those are some things about Timothy and Titus, the recipients of these letters. Now, something that I have to mention here, and this can be kind of difficult to think about especially when we're thinking about Bible, because we've been raised to think that everything in the Bible is exactly as it's presented. If the Bible is going to be reliable, you need to believe that everything in there is true and happened exactly as it's described. But there's some difficulties with the history and sort of matching what we know of Paul's history and ministry with what we find in these pastoral letters especially. And I'll get to some of the ways that people deal with this, and some of them may be a bit controversial, but I want to get it out there so that everyone knows that these things are out there, and I believe that you can do good biblical research and biblical study and still, maintain a faith in the importance of the Bible and the reliability of the Bible. So some of these difficulties, okay, in matching up the details in the pastoral epistles with what we know. The letter to Titus I have here, it talks a lot about this ministry on the island of Crete. Okay, and Paul and Titus were both involved in this. And it seems that Paul has had to go away, and Titus is still kind of there doing some things. And so Paul gives him some, advice for dealing with ministry on this island of Crete. And some of it is actually kind of almost, almost offensive. Paul is talking about these statements that people have made, about people on Crete, that they're just always liars and they're unreliable and all these things. Okay, but yeah, anyway, so Paul and Titus are, they formed this church. They did this ministry on Crete, and Paul is telling Titus about, what it's like to be there and what Titus should be doing. Problem is that there's no mention anyplace else in the New Testament, in Acts or any of the letters of Paul, that Paul ever went to Crete, that he ever set up a ministry there with Titus, or that he even planned to go there. Okay, in a lot of these letters, Paul will talk about how he really wants to visit, right? He really wants to visit Philemon's church. He very much wants to visit Thessalonians again. Other places he almost threatens to visit. In some of his letters to the Corinthians, he's saying, if you don't shape up, I'm going to have to come and pay you a visit in person. Okay, and so yeah, Paul is not shy about writing in his letters, telling people his plans. He tells the Romans that he wants to visit them and maybe even go on to Spain. Right? And in Acts, it talks about Paul's plans to visit places like Macedonia, and that Paul had this vision to go to Macedonia. And so there's a lot of detail about Paul's travels, his journeys, his ministry, and then also his plans. Even if, this desire to go to Spain, it never materialized. There's nothing that says that Paul ever planned to go to Crete. Okay, or that he ever stopped there, that he ever started a ministry there. Okay, so this is it's reasonable to ask, that this is so central to the letter of Titus. Why isn't this mentioned anyplace else? Okay, if Paul is spending so much time talking about, these are the issues and these are the things that you have to keep in mind on Crete. Yeah, where else is, this detail? Why don't we have record of a church started there? And why don't we have a letter written to the church on Crete? Now, the letters to Timothy are presented as, letters written from Paul to Timothy. And it seems that Paul has left Timothy kind of in charge of that church in Ephesus. And I mentioned before, right, that tradition holds that Timothy was the first bishop of Ephesus, and that probably because of what we learn in 1st and 2nd Timothy. Now, again, we don't have any record of this in the New Testament. There are also some details here. Paul talks about that he had this hearing, and nobody stuck around to be with him, and he was kind of hurt about this, but God helped him and God gave him strength. We don't know that this ever happened, and it seems like from some of Paul's other letters, if this is referring to Paul's imprisonment in Rome at the end of Acts, there are other sources that suggest that Timothy was there with him. Okay, if you take some of these letters that were written from prison, letters like Philippians or Philemon, it seems like Timothy is there with Paul. And he's even listed as a co-author of some of these letters. And so, yeah, what's going on here? Paul is writing as if he's writing to Timothy in Ephesus, but hey, if Timothy is there with Paul in Rome, okay, yeah, there's some kind of disconnect here. So, what do we do with some of these, seemingly difficulties or like problems with this record that we have? Okay, one answer that has been suggested is, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? The New Testament is like, we have the book of Acts that's kind of a nicely laid out history about the activities of the early church and how the Holy Spirit, led the church to expand. But then the rest of it, it's kind of filled in, in kind of a haphazard fashion. We have aside from Acts, we have the letters of Paul, and then some of these other letters, James and Peter, and then we have like Revelation. Okay, but those aren't kind of a systematic, well laid out history. Especially like the letters of Paul, they're kind of these, just we get these letters written to certain situations, and we have to kind of get the details that we can out of them. And so one possible answer is that, we just don't have a record of these things. They happened. Okay, Paul and Titus did go to Crete and set up a church. Timothy was over in Ephesus, and Paul wanted to write to him. And so these things happened, but we just don't have that record because our history is kind of in pieces, and we get little partial sort of soundings, or just these short little episodes of things, and these big gaps, maybe of several years in between when we don't know what happened. And maybe these activities did happen in those gaps that we don't know about. And that's certainly reasonable. That is very true about the historical record of the New Testament. It is sort of fragmentary. We get, a lot of details about, say, the Corinthian church, but we don't get any details really about, like, Paul's activity in Athens. We know that something happened there because of one chapter in Acts, okay, or even a few verses out of one chapter in Acts. What did Paul do? Beyond that, did he set up a church there? Were there Christians there in Athens? We don't really know. Okay, we just get kind of this really episodic, fragmentary view of what was happening. So maybe, yeah, those things happen, and we just don't have records of them outside of these letters. The second thing, the second theory that has been put forth is that this imprisonment that we read about at the end of Acts, that has Paul journeying to Rome, we kind of assume that because the story ends there, and we don't get anything else, and some of Paul's letters talk about him being in prison, but then we never hear about him leaving prison. We don't hear about him getting out of prison or going and setting up churches elsewhere. And so there's this theory that Paul actually did not die during this first imprisonment. Okay, he was not martyred during his imprisonment that we read about at the end of Acts. Okay, even though most scholars, most sources think that he in fact was executed then, because again, we don't get any record of him, leaving prison or doing anything else. But maybe Acts just ended, and because that's the end of like the gospel going to Rome, and so that's all that Luke wanted to write about, and so just ended it there. Okay, and maybe Paul, after that imprisonment, was actually let go. He was released, and then he left and he went and did some more things. Right? What we read about in these pastoral letters might have been what they call a second career. Okay? The first career was all of his journeys and things leading up to his imprisonment in Rome, And yeah, maybe he was released from there. He went out and did some more things, like set up a church in Crete. And then perhaps he was once again arrested because Paul had a propensity to cause trouble and be arrested. Okay, and then in that second imprisonment, then he may have been martyred. Okay, so that's another idea. That okay, where did some of these things happen? Well, maybe yeah, Paul had this second career, and he went out and did some more interesting things that we just don't read about, but we have it here. All right, the last theory is that Paul did not actually write the pastoral letters, or he didn't write parts of it. Okay, the pastoral letters were composed after Paul's death. It says Paul wrote them, and they have some personal details in there. So did somebody just like pick up a pen and say, hey, you know what? I'm Paul. I'm going to write these letters, and I'm going to I'm going to write a whole bunch of lies about like, I know all these people. I'm going to come and see all these people. And hey, you know what? I left my coat with at this church. Can you grab it for me and bring it to me? Okay. Did somebody just make all of that stuff up? Okay. Or, maybe that's not what happened. Okay. Maybe we don't have like, somebody just writing a bunch of fake history, but maybe, it was like Paul's notes and some actual correspondence from Paul, but that people took a little bit later, maybe after his death, and filled stuff in. Okay, in particular, it seems like something that gives credence to this theory. Scholars have noticed that the pastoral epistles deal with a lot of church governance and church structure. You have all of these different church offices, and we're going to list the offices. We're going to list the qualifications for these things. And scholars have said that there isn't really any evidence that the very, very early church, okay, we're talking between mid-30s when Jesus died and was taken to heaven, and the mid-50s to early 60s when Paul was active. In that time, okay, sort of this proto-Christian church, you had a lot of activity and expansion, but we don't see a lot of this sort of church hierarchy, the sort of church structure, church offices, and these are the qualifications. The church didn't seem really interested in that. Church was more emphasizing things like, let's get out, spread the gospel. What are some basic things to believe about Jesus that we can plug even Jewish people or Gentiles in, and just teach them the basics about the gospel and who Jesus is. And so you have apostles, you have teachers, leaders, prophets. Not so much bishops or deacons, these kinds of roles that have to do with an institutional, settled-in sort of church. Those things come a lot later, maybe into even the 2nd century. And so, scholars have looked at this and said, I don't know if this is, something that happened when Paul was writing. So maybe, Paul had written stuff out, and people had this correspondence, but then people also were like, we need to keep this tradition of Paul. We need to keep his ideas going and make sure that the church is progressing faithfully according to his ideas. And so they set up, they set up these offices, and then they wrote these things down in these letters to kind of give general counsel to churches as they were setting things up. So that's the third idea, okay, that Paul did not actually write these, or maybe he wrote parts of them and somebody else edited and compiled stuff and sent these out. Okay. Whatever the case, whatever you believe, okay, whether you believe that Paul wrote them or that somebody else did sometime after Paul's death, it seemed to be, if Paul wrote these, it seems to be like these were composed like near the end of his life. Okay, again, maybe during like this second career that he had. And the letters are kind of his idea that I need to put down my ideas so that the church can continue after I am gone. All right. Either this is Paul thinking this, or maybe like some disciples or followers of Paul thinking that, yeah, the church needs these ideas to continue as it grows and changes. All right, so what are some themes of these pastoral letters? Um, I mentioned before that they are very concerned with church government, offices, structure. The thing about this is that you have a number of church offices that are listed, but we don't really know what they did, okay, or what the difference is between, for example, like a bishop and an elder. Um, a bishop, yeah, now we think of a bishop as like somebody who is overseeing like a number of churches in a geographical area. But something that I have read is that we need to take care not to think about, when we read bishop, don't think about bishop today, say in, the Anglican Church or Episcopalian or Catholic Church, okay? These may have been roles similar to like a pastor, what we think of a pastor, a minister, or even a deacon. And so we don't really get a lot of details about what went into these, but what we do get a lot of is the kind of person that would occupy these offices, and really what the early church was looking for in church leaders. Paul mentions that, gets really into, the qualifications for an elder, right? It has to be a person, of upstanding moral character, married only once, a good example to children, all of these things. Okay, and so we get a lot of focus on the kind of moral qualities that you need in a church leader. Really interesting thing that I think maybe we need to take account of is that these pastoral letters suggest that it's better not to have enough leaders. Okay? It's better to have a shortage of leaders than to ordain lots of people and have some of those people not be living up to these moral standards that we need. Okay? They're going to disgrace the community, they're going to lead them astray, and they're not going to stand firm when false teachings come into the church. And it's better, Paul says in 1 Timothy, that you need to be careful and you need to go slowly when it comes to ordaining leaders. Okay? It's better that you have only a few leaders rather than ordaining the wrong people. Okay? That was a very important point to Paul in these letters. All right. Very important thing in the pastorals is this idea of sound doctrine and truth and the quality and the kind of teaching that is going on. Talks a lot about opposing false teachers, standing up for the truth and the dangers of false teachings coming into the community and sort of infecting the community and leading people astray. The nature of these teachings, these falsehoods, doesn't really get into that. We don't know what exactly they're talking about. They do mention things about like Jewish mysticism, okay, some of these ideas, that you need to be aware of and be careful of. So we think that it probably was maybe a combination of the old and the new. Right, Paul in his ministry was always fighting with and always arguing with these people that we call them the Judaizers. Right, we need to move everything back to Judaism. You need to go back to the traditions. You need to become circumcised and all of these things. And Paul very much fought against that. Then you have going forward. Okay, you have this secret knowledge. That God has revealed this knowledge to people, and you don't really have to worry about the scriptures because the real revelation is now God is revealing new things to us, and you have to do all of these secret rituals and things to get this knowledge that will kind of free you from your body. What we later know as Gnosticism, and it would become a big problem later, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. Okay, this blending these kinds of Gnostic secret Greek philosophy ideas with Christianity, and so you have here really the dangers of falling into the ditch on the traditional, historic, conservative side, going back to the way things were, and keeping everything, exactly the same as it was, and then kind of, going forward into, the speculative, progressive side that is pushing forward and seeking new knowledge and things. And in the pastoral letters here, you really have this attempt to kind of steer down, the middle sort of narrow way and not fall into the ditch on either, what we would consider sort of the liberal progressive side and the historic conservative side. We do not have a description of like the motives of these false teachers. We just know that they were there, and we also know that there's this big problem that church members are willing to listen to them, and they're willing to like forsake these teachings that Paul had taught them, and the traditions that he set up. And they're going, out and again, either going to the one end with the Gnostic teachers and the philosophy teachers, or going back into Judaism and saying, keep the law, be circumcised, and all of that. Real problem there is that people are losing track of the truth. People are not caring about what is true, and these teachers come in and they kind of pander to people. They tell people what they want to hear, and then church members are like, "Hey, this is good. Let's follow this." In the pastoral letters, we discover how do you deal with this. Okay, first of all, you need to rebuke these false teachers. Just give them one warning and argue against them once, but then Paul says, don't continue debating with them. If they won't correct their path, then you just don't have anything to do with them. And then also, again, going back to what we said about the church leadership, you need to choose strong leaders so that they can lead the church well and protect the people from these false teachers. Okay, again, big emphasis on the moral qualities and character of these leaders. Okay. Teaching should be consistent with Paul's doctrine. And what does that mean? What are the themes? How do we know what is right doctrine? A really interesting characteristic of the pastoral epistles is that you get these every once in a while in all of the letters. You get these sort of short, punchy statements that are almost like and this is kind of a bad word in Adventism, but they're kind of like creedal statements. These short, basic statements of belief that people can recite and memorize. They're very easy to memorize, and that people can recite these things, and they are kind of a reminder of what the true belief is. Okay, and so what are those things? Well, we have these creeds in the pastoral epistles. First of all, you have this affirmation about faith in Christ and salvation. Okay, who is Jesus? What did Jesus do? And what did Jesus' death do on our behalf? All right, and you see those references there. Instruction that leads to moral behavior, also in Titus. Okay, so you have this sort of two-pronged thing. Okay, you have to know who Christ is and believe the right thing about what Christ did, and also what it means to be a good person, to follow Jesus, and to conduct yourself in the right way. Another thing that comes up a lot in the pastorals is the good news of suffering. Really strange idea, but not new to Paul, right? Other letters that Paul writes are written from prison, and Paul is writing these letters from prison. And he says, yeah, many people have abandoned him. Demas, he mentions in 2 Timothy, Demas fell in love with the world and he abandoned me and he went off to Thessaloniki. Okay, and then some of these other people who stayed faithful to him, but they got called elsewhere, and so they're not able to be there with him. So Paul is not happy about this, okay, but at the same time, he affirms that these sorts of things will happen. He says, I'm not ashamed of my suffering. This is a very bad thing to happen in Roman culture. Roman culture is all about saving face, and your public, image. And being thrown into prison is a pretty bad strike against that public image. Paul says, I don't care. I am not ashamed of this. And these things are going to happen when you live for Jesus. Okay, when you live for Jesus, you're going to get persecuted. And you just look at my life and look at what happens to me. Everywhere he goes, he's persecuted. He's suffering all of these things. But he says, you know what? That's what happens when you are faithful to Jesus. Those who suffer for Christ, he says, now we're suffering, now we have bad things happening, but we have the promise of glory forever, and this can also actually save others along with us. So that's why I'm okay with suffering. I saved this one towards the end, and it's a difficulty. It's a difficulty I have personally. Anybody who's heard me speak, anybody who has had anything to do with me as a minister, that I am very much in favor of women in leadership in the church. I have been privileged to teach at La Sierra University for more than 10 years now, and in that time I have taught a number of incredibly gifted women who are going into pastoring or other functions in the church. And I have no problem saying that they have now surpassed me, and some of them are my colleagues in this in Southeastern California Conference in this district, and I marvel at the kinds of things that these former students of mine are doing now as women in ministry. Our church could not run without women in very important positions, doing important work and making critical decisions. I'm not even sure this church would be around if we didn't have women leadership, women in leadership. These letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, they say some things that are kind of difficult, okay, dealing with women and their place in the church. And I've put some of those there. Okay, you can see them. Famous text that is used, almost to shut down discussion. If we're talking about, can women be leaders? Can women be ordained? Can women be ministers? This text is almost, used as like a club and to pretty much shut down discussion. Well, don't you believe 1 Timothy 2:12? Okay, and that's kind of the end of it in people's minds. Okay, and we don't talk about it. Never mind, the evidence in front of you about like what women are doing and what women pastors are doing. Okay, but yeah, sure. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent, and that's used as the end of the conversation. Okay. Proceeds to argue that Eve was deceived. It was a woman who was deceived, and became a transgressor, okay, and so therefore, women can't have authority. And then this statement that I still don't know what to make of, that women will be saved through childbearing. This is, and here's the difficulty with this, right? These things are all like totally against what Paul says elsewhere. He lists a number of women in a number of his letters, and he calls them his co-workers. He calls them, these are, gifted people. He leans on them. They're his companions, his co-workers. He says, his ministry wouldn't be anything without them. And so, what do we do with this? Okay, what do we go back here? How do you deal with this? Okay, when we read about Chloe, when we read about Priscilla, Junia, all of these women in Paul's life and ministry, and then we have this thing that says, I don't permit any woman to teach. She'll be saved through childbearing. Okay. To me, I think what we do with this is, you need to focus on what the context was. Okay, if this was Paul writing to Timothy in Ephesus, perhaps there was something going on in Ephesus that made Paul say, you know what, women in that church, women in that context, should not be allowed to speak because there's some kind of issue there that makes their participation a problem or disruptive. And we do know that Ephesus had this strong sort of cult of Artemis, and Artemis was the goddess of like virginity and women's, not really women's empowerment because you didn't really have that idea back then. But, that Artemis was, this goddess who single women would pray to and, almost didn't need a man, didn't need a husband. And so, this cult was very strong there. And so maybe there was something about that made Paul write this. So focus on what is a full picture? What do we see in the pastoral epistles, but also compare it to what Paul wrote before? Yeah. All of these things can be super divisive and problematic in the church. Okay, women's roles, right? False teaching, how to deal with church leaders. They can all lead to problems, and the pastoral epistles are an attempt in the first century to deal with these things. Okay? And we have a number of principles that we can apply to church leadership. A church leader should be somebody of outstanding moral character. They should be somebody who can make hard decisions and who is focused on following Jesus when things get difficult. These are the truths that we can get from these letters, even if some of these things, when taken literally, would really set us back, especially in like our North American modern 21st century context. Okay, you go into a city and try to do an evangelistic crusade, and you tell women that they need to be silent in church and they need to submit to their husbands, and they can be saved. They can go to heaven if they bear children. You're probably going to end up with protests outside of your meeting rather than a whole bunch of converts, right? And some people, of course, would say, "Oh, you know what? This is persecution. This is and those things that Paul said in the pastoral epistles." I tend to think that these sort of messages that we do unfortunately hear in the church sometimes are actually, they actually do turn people off from the church, and they do a disservice to the church. Okay? There is a call that we do need to remember, where we came from, what we are believing, but we also do need to look forward. And, we need to think about how do we do pastoral ministry in our context today. So those are some things that I think, we can get from the pastoral epistles. I actually have really come to appreciate these letters. When I was in college, as a young pastor, I didn't really care for these. They don't have a lot of theology. They don't have, kind of your soaring statements about like faith and salvation, and the kind of assurance that we have in Jesus Christ, these kinds of things. It is really down to kind of this nitty gritty, how do we do church in, this context, and, how do we do with church leadership and problems of false teaching and such, and so I didn't really care for them. And plus, then you had all that controversial stuff about, women and ministry, and women are responsible for sin, and people from Crete are liars and unkempt, and you don't trust them and whatever. You had those kinds of difficult statements that I was like, but I've come to appreciate these, because of really, the heart for pastoral leadership and the emphasis on what is leadership in the church, and why is it important, and just how important it is to get right. And unfortunately, we've seen in the church in the last few years what happens when church leaders fall. Okay, we've had some pretty high profile ministers, both in the Adventist church and kind of in the American church in general, really run into problems with moral failures, or just failures of judgment, and leadership, and the kinds of hurt and disgrace it's brought into a lot of churches. And so I think these epistles have a lot of wisdom and are very important for us today. Okay, so those are some things about this, and I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you take some time to read through these and maybe sift through, not just hit those difficult, controversial passages, but also think about, what is God saying to us through these, and what can we learn from these? I think it can be a lot. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and hope that you will be able to catch our worship service, 11:10 on Sabbath morning, and also we will be doing this Bible study again next week. So have a great end to your week, and yeah, hope everybody is able to join us on Sabbath. God bless everyone. All right, bye.